Okay, so a couple days ago, I posted a video telling you guys not to buy the Sony A6700 and instead buy the Sony A7 IV. Let's just say I got a ton of comments from people who missed the point of the video, or maybe I made it unclear, but it wasn't to directly compare the A6700 with an A7 IV, because that would be an unfair comparison, comparing an APS-C camera to a full frame. I also wasn't making the video to hate on the A6700 and APS-C cameras and say that full frame cameras are better. I don't hate the A6700 and I don't hate APS-C cameras. If I was looking for an APS-C camera right now, I'd probably go with the A6700. It's probably the best one on the market you can buy right now, at least from Sony. I just know that if I was in the market to buy a camera, and this is the reason why I made the video, was that if I'm in the market to buy a camera, and the camera that I actually want is like the A7R5 and these higher end cameras, but I'm settling with the A6700 because of my budget, also because it's priced well for the specs that it has. And I stumbled across a video like mine telling me that don't forget about the A7 IV and the A7R4 and other cameras that you can get used now that are a couple years older that will give you a better value for your money than something like the A6700. If I was watching that video and I knew that I can spend an extra $500 and get a full frame camera, dual SD card slots, more megapixels, more specs all around, a deeper buffer, things like that, that I would much rather go with that option than the A6700. Not that the A6700 is a bad camera. But with that being said, I'm gonna give you my honest opinion on the Sony A6700. It's not a review, it's solely based off the spec sheet and what I've heard from other people who have it. In this video, I'm gonna talk about the pros, the cons, the things I like, the things I don't like, and who I think this camera is for. So let's start with the pros of this camera. The A6700 is a APS-C crop sensor camera. For some people, this can be considered a pro, and this can be considered a con. There's nothing wrong with an APS-C camera. It does have its benefits. It also has its downsides. For me personally, now that I'm shooting with a full frame camera, I don't think I would ever go back to an APS-C camera unless it was something like the FX30. So the first pro of an APS-C camera, like a lot of you guys mentioned, is that lenses are generally cheaper, especially if you're comparing them to native Sony lenses, like Sony G Master lenses. Yes, those lenses are gonna be out of the same price category as APS-C lenses. However, I've been rocking third-party lenses on my full-frame A7 IV, like the Sigma 16-28 that I'm filming on now. I have my 24-70 by Sigma. I also have my 35mm. All these lenses are extremely high quality, and these are about half the cost of native Sony lenses, putting it in the same price range as APS-C lenses. So yes, native APS-C lenses are cheaper, but there are other options out there if you wanted to go the full-frame route. APS-C cameras are typically cheaper. That's why the A6700 is priced so well. It's also much smaller and much more compact than cameras in the A7 lineup. And that's again because it is a crop sensor camera. Most APS-C cameras are smaller, much more compact, and easy and better for portability. The A6700 can shoot 4K 120, and I'm a little jealous. I think that's awesome because cameras like my A7 IV can't do that. If you get the A6700, you're gonna get Sony's latest AI processor, the same one that's in the ZVE1 and the A7R5. You're gonna get AI features like auto reframing and frame stabilizer. You'll also get Unreal autofocus with the A6700 because it does utilize the same AI processing unit as the A7R5. And I've tried the A7R5, the autofocus is unreal. So the A6700 will be utilizing the AI processing unit for human pose estimation, which is gonna be great for anybody who shoots video or shooting portraits. The autofocusing system can also track cars, birds, animals, trains, airplanes, insects, birds, and all of that. For you guys that shoot video, you'll appreciate that you can import LUTs onto the A6700, which I'm jealous of because I wish the A7 IV had that. I'm always talking about how I wish this was a feature, but you'll be able to see those LUTs on your footage as you're recording. For the people who are planning to use the A6700 for streaming, you'll be able to actually stream in 4K. You'll get 14 stops of dynamic range. You'll get a 4K image downsampled from a 6K sensor. It has a flip out screen. You'll get 5-axis in-body image stabilization, and it has 26 megapixel sensor. Personally, I think anything over 24 megapixels is acceptable and good enough if you ever want to print your photos. It'll also be a small enough package that you can carry around everywhere with you. It's not going to be super bulky like cameras like the A7 IV and all these other full frame cameras. Now let's talk about the camera's problems. And these problems can be different for everybody else, but these are just, in my opinion, the problems with the A6700. Now, like I said, for me personally, I don't think I would ever go back to an APS-C sensor camera, especially after going full frame. Not that there's anything wrong with APS-C. I was actually planning on getting an FX30 or an X100V, which are both APS-C sensor cameras, but I would have to keep my A7 IV just because I love full frame so much. So if I was to get an APS-C sensor camera, I would keep it as kind of like a secondary camera. I think full frame is the better option for me. I personally just don't like the crop factor. I know you can get APS-C lenses that are full frame equivalent, but I just don't like doing the math. I also like that full frame cameras are gonna get you more depth of field, so you're gonna get more bokeh. And I also just like that cameras like my A7 IV are going to perform better in low light situations. APS-C cameras generally just don't hold up in low light situations. Shooting in 4K 120. I know I threw that up into the pros, and I do think being able to shoot in 4K 120 is awesome. I do wish the A7 IV had it. However, I think the crop factor is a little insane. So to explain this, any lens that you throw on your A6700, you're gonna get a 1.5 times crop. So if you throw a 35mm on the A6700, you're gonna get a 1.5 times crop, which is gonna bring that 35mm to about 52mm. Now, if you switch it into 4K 120, you have to apply another 1.5 times crop on top of your previous focal length that you were at. So on top of that 52mm, which is gonna get you to about 78mm. So your initial 35mm lens or 35mm focal length is now becoming a 78mm if you want to shoot in 4K 120. Which means for all my video shooters out there, if you're shooting a subject at 4K 24 frames per second and you're this close to them, now you want to get some slow motion shots at 4K 120, you're either gonna have to swap to a super wide lens, or you're gonna have to back up super far for that 4K 120 crop factor to not affect the shot. And trust me, I've had to deal with this because the A7 IV has its own crop when shooting in 4K 60, so it's not just the A6700. The A6700 will be able to shoot at a maximum of 11 frames per second, which is an improvement. However, its buffer depth is pretty small at only 59 raw photos. Meaning if you're shooting in high plus continuous mode and you're just holding down that shutter button and you do fill up that buffer, you're gonna see a drastic slowdown in the A6700's performance. Again, not a fair comparison, but if you're talking about specs or the problems a camera has, you need to compare it to something. And if you compare this buffer depth to the buffer that the A7 IV has, the A7 IV's buffer depth can store 828 raw photos before you're gonna get any sort of slowdown in your camera's performance. The A6700 only has one SD card slot, and you won't be able to use your CF Express Type A cards in the A6700. For me personally, I will never go back to a camera that shoots with only one SD card slot. I love the redundancy and I love having a backup after a project, knowing that if something happens to one card, I'll have backups to another card. I've had cards break on me in the past just as I'm about to put them into the computer, so I don't want to have to worry about shooting only to one card. The A6700 has a micro HDMI port, and for a lot of people, this is not going to matter. Who cares about the HDMI port on a camera? But for my videographers out there and people who actually use them with external monitors and things like that, you're going to appreciate a camera that has a full HDMI port. Micro HDMI ports are a lot more fragile, they break much easier, and also you don't want to have to buy adapters or a special cable to be able to use an external monitor on the A6700. I don't know, for me personally, because I do use external monitors, I'm using one right now for this video, I appreciate cameras that have full-size HDMI ports. With that being said, does an APS-C sensor, one SD card slot, and a micro HDMI port make this A6700 a bad camera? No. I think it all depends on the person who is using this camera and what you're using this camera for. For those who are looking for APS-C cameras because of its compact size and its other benefits, or you already have a bunch of APS-C lenses, the A6700 is probably going to be the best Sony camera you can buy right now. If you're a content creator or a streamer and there's no need to buy a higher end camera, I also think that the A6700 is going to be the best camera you can buy right now. However, if you are a professional photographer who is going to be using their camera for professional projects and client projects, you're going to want a camera with dual SD card slots so you can have that redundancy. If you're shooting a wedding, you don't want to risk losing all of those photos because they're only being backed up to one card. If you're shooting a wedding and you're holding down your shutter button because you don't want to miss a shot, you don't want to have to worry about your camera stopping and slowing down because you filled up that temporary buffer. You don't want to have those worries. So in that case, I would say that the A6700 is not the right camera for you. Again, this is just based off of specs. If you're a professional videographer who wants a camera that can perform well in low light, you want a full-size HDMI port, you also want the ability to use your CF Express Type A cards because they're extremely fast, and you don't want to have to worry about your camera overheating. Again, the A6700 is probably not the camera for you. So no, I don't hate the A6700. I think it just depends on the person who is using the camera. And like I mentioned in the other video, there are other options out there. You can get a used camera that's a year, 2, 3 years old, like the A7 IV, that is going to get you more value in terms of specs and features for your money. And it might even check off more boxes for you. I don't know what you're gonna be using this camera for. With that being said, the A6700 is a great camera, just not a great camera for me. If you enjoyed this video or you found it useful, make sure you click that like button and hit that subscribe button to support the channel, to see more content like this, but also to help me beat this dentist guy on here. I'll see you in the next one.